With the company behind Cursor raising capital at a $9 billion valuation and OpenAI acquiring Windsurf for $3 billion, it is clear that we can no longer make fun of developers creating ChatGPT wrappers. Besides being AI wrappers, both Cursor and Windsurf are also forks of what used to be my favorite IDE, VS Code. And with many developers switching from VS Code to a paid Cursor or Windsurf subscription, Microsoft seems to have realized that they are losing out on a lot of cash by having others creating improved versions of VS Code, and are now rapidly trying to catch up by having releases with 90% of the new features being related to Copilot. So, with the AI IDE battle heating up, I thought it would be very interesting to compare the three and decide which IDE is currently the best one by creating a project for a future video and constantly switching between the three IDEs. So, if you're in the same situation as me and you don't know which IDE, AI-powered IDE is the best, you have come to the right video. By the way, if you think that I should instead just use Vim, well, I did try that for a month, but I quickly realized that spending more time deciding the optimal sequence of keystrokes and configuring my IDE than actually coding probably isn't worth the benefit of being able to flex on my colleagues, especially with the work from home policy at my company. So unless that gets reversed or my job gets too boring, I'm just going to stick to VS Code forks for now. During my studies, I always used VS Code, and being a student meant you could get a free GitHub Pro account, which came bundled with Github Copilot. So this was in 2021, and I believe Copilot was also one of the first AI-assisted coding tools released, and I still remember being completely mind-blown by it, and it was a huge help during the last few years of my studies. After I got a job, my student Copilot license of course expired, and as I was relying more and more on ChatGPT instead of the Copilot autocompletions, I decided not to renew my Copilot subscription, but instead I subscribed to ChatGPT Plus. So fast forward to September of last year, and a colleague of mine showed me Cursor, and it was also really being hyped up on the internet at the moment. It really seemed like the second coming of Christ, and as it had a trial period, I decided to try it out. And before the trial period expired, within a few hours I already bought a subscription because it was that good. So before this video, Cursor was really my main IDE, and at the end of the video you know if it still is, but my experience with Windsurf is very limited. I only heard about it as a Copilot and Cursor alternative, and it only popped up in my head after I saw that OpenAI bought it for $3 billion, so I had to try it out. And as I said, my GitHub Copilot experience dates back from 2023. So let's now find out in this video whether I should simply cancel my Cursor subscription and go back to GitHub Copilot, or whether I should switch to Windsurf. So first things first, and that's the installation process. For all the IDEs, this is very quick. Also with Cursor and Windsurf, you are given the option to simply import all your VS Code settings and extensions. So if you're already using VS Code as your main IDE, it will simply take only a minute to both download and install both Cursor and Windsurf. A first important feature all these three IDEs offer is the autocomplete feature, which will predict and complete the code from your cursor position, and it will also try to predict the next completion, which can potentially be in a different part of your codebase, so it can also make your cursor jump a bit. In all IDEs, the way to accept autocompletes is with the tab button, so this can easily put you in a flow state where you just keep accepting the tabs, and you imagine how nice life is and how good the world can be sometimes, until you realize that most of the suggestions were made up code. But hey, 80% is still working, and fixing the rest takes less time than actually having to read the documentation. So this is one of the features for which each IDE has also trained its own model that is unique to that IDE. So the autocomplete is a very important feature to decide which AI IDE will be the best. The type model of Windsurf is called SVE1 Mini, and after using it for a few weeks, it feels like a very good model. It often correctly knows what to do. For example, based on the load keyword and the rest of my code, it realizes I want to load in a YAML. The model can also correctly suggest and import files that are necessary to make my code work. It's of course important to note that the autocompletes aren't always correct, but in general, Windsurf often manage to put me into this Zen state, as they claim, where I'm just tabbing away, coding much faster than I normally would. There are some stretches though where I could even go a long time without encountering any mistakes. Windsurf also suggests relatively large code blocks, for example all these exception handlers, which if the suggestion is correct can really speed you up. The mistakes that Windsurf did make were often easily fixable, such for example here it assumed that I could use the dot notation to access scrape items, when in fact they need to be accessed like a dict. When taking into consideration my experience with Cursor, I feel like Windsurf makes a bit more mistakes, but nothing that different. However, something I definitely never saw with Cursor was having the same thing suggested over and over again. Although it didn't happen very often, it did happen a few times while coding. Not that it's super annoying though, but it can bother you a bit and bring you out of your flow state, which Windsurf claims to offer. However, it's still very important to check what exactly Windsurf is suggesting, such that you actually write tests for it, because the autocomplete can still make mistakes sometimes. The autocomplete of Github Copilot is powered by GPT-4o Copilot, which is based on GPT-4o Mini, and like all the other models, it can provide code completions. I can say right away that this completion model of Copilot is much weaker than the models from Cursor and Windsurf. First off, it lacks features that the other autocompletes do have, such as being able to suggest autocompletions for missing imports. And after having used the other two autocompletes, it just feels very outdated having to right-click to import files, which I know when I hear myself saying this, I realize how spoiled we are with these newer AI models. But besides that, the autocompletes are also very often simply incorrect. Here, it first suggests a method to call the Gemini API with incorrect parameters. Then it wants to replace a method to call this method, but instead of replacing the whole method, it just replaces the method name and the first argument with the new method, which is not even syntactically correct. Suggestions like this simply slow you down, and you can see that next added suggestion is supported, but it's implemented very badly. For very simple autocompletes, Copilot does work though, and for that it can speed you up a bit, but if you expect any intelligence, you will be very disappointed. I also feel like the autocompletes of Copilot are often very lazy. Instead of actually implementing classes, it will often just suggest method headers with a comment that I have to implement it myself. Like, what the hell, this is actually the reverse situation. I want to type in the method header and the autocomplete should actually implement it. This is just the reverse. Sometimes Copilot also starts suggesting imports which are not relevant to the code, and on top of it, it places them all in the middle of the file instead of on top. After using Windsurf and Cursor, this feels very outdated. I feel like Copilot also really lacks context about your directory and file structure, as it will literally just make up path names. Copilot only really feels good for suggesting very basic syntax, but the suggestions themselves feel very greedy and lacking in intelligence. Even within a single file, Copilot doesn't seem to really understand your code base. For example, here it suggests to check if the score is between 1 and 5, but this is already being checked by the method which is called right before, so either the model doesn't get enough context in its input, or the Copilot autocomplete model has just a very weak understanding of code in general. There are also very obvious mistakes, like getting stuck suggesting the same imports in the middle of the file. I have also seen this behavior with Windsurf, but this feels a bit worse, especially because we are importing things in the middle of the file. If you decide to try out Copilot for yourself, you will notice that these scenarios where it keeps suggesting you the same things happen more than with the other autocomplete models. Just in general, it feels like I'm often just fighting with Copilot to force it to do the thing that I wanted to do. And besides getting syntax suggestions, there isn't much intelligence going on, which feels quite weird, as I remember back in 2021 that I was really impressed with this model. Let's also now take a look at the cursor autocomplete model, which is called Fusion, and this is, in my opinion, by far the best one. You simply have to try it out for yourself, but the autocompletes feel very intelligent. I also feel like it makes a bit less errors than Windsurf, but I don't have hard statistics on that one. Also, the next added prediction model is simply godlike. Just look at how fast I'm moving around in my file, editing things by just pressing the tab button. It really feels like magic. The autocomplete model is also updated very often, and in the most recent release it can even suggest code in different files, which is something the other two autocompletes don't offer. In general, I feel like Copilot is by far the worst autocomplete model and doesn't come even close to the rest. And between Windsurf and Cursor is a close battle, but from my experience, Cursor is just a bit smoother, faster, and makes slightly less mistakes. It's also being able to do some more cool features like suggesting code in other files, which can definitely improve your productivity. The next big feature besides autocompletes, which all these IDEs offer, is some kind of way to interact with your code base through a chat interface. And each IDE also has different chat modes in which you can select how much, I promise not to say this, vibe coding you want. Just forget I said that word, how much, depending on how much AI assistance you want, I mean. And Cursor has 3 different modes. First it has the ask mode, which is a read-only mode in which you can ask questions about your code base. But you can also ask changes, but it will just propose the code changes, but it won't apply the code changes themselves. So you can decide for yourself whether to apply the change or not. You also have manual mode. In this mode, Cursor is able to do inline suggestions of the code you requested, but you have to manually select which part of your code base Cursor should consider when generating an answer. And then the most automatic mode is called agent mode. And this is just like manual mode in that it will do inline suggestions, but it will also decide for itself which files to read, and it can search through your code base to get the relevant context. I personally think that the agent modes of all of these is a bit overrated, and I often end up just using the ask mode, as I find it a bit hard to understand if I already see the changes applied to my code base and I first want to manually process the changes through a chat interface and then manually decide for myself whether I want to apply them or not. So I like that Cursor offered this. Copilot just has these same modes but just remained them a bit. So in Copilot, ask mode is the same as the Cursor ask mode, edit mode is the same as the manual mode of Cursor, and agent mode is the same as the Cursor agent mode. And in Windsurf you just have 2 modes, the chat mode which is the ask mode of Cursor but a bit worse, I will explain that later, and write mode, which is the same as agent mode. In these chat and agent modes you can always decide for yourself which LLM you want to use, but not every IDE supports each LLM. In Windsurf you can, as you can see, choose between a lot of different LLMs, even models like DeepSeek and the different reasoning variants of the OpenAI models. However, I feel like it's a bit stupid that you have to bring your own API key for Claude 4 Sonnet and that you don't get any usage included with your subscription. Using your own API key can become expensive very quickly. So if I'm already paying for a subscription, I also expect being able to use each model at least for a few requests. However, some models are absent with Windsurf, such as GPT 4.5 and O1 is also not available, but we can't really complain here about the selection that's being offered. In Github Copilot, there is a much smaller selection, but the most important models are all available. So unless you are a diehard DeepSeek or Grok fan, these will definitely be sufficient for your needs. I also like that you don't have to hook up your own API key to use certain models. Cursor also has a large selection with almost any model you would want to use. Although it's a bit stupid that the larger reasoning models such as Claude 4 Opus and OpenAI O3, which are probably the best coding models available, once again require you to link your own API key. But I do like that they also offer preview models such as Gemini 2.5 Flash, which aren't available in the other IDEs. So I personally feel like Cursor wins out here with having the largest model selection and also offering preview models such as Gemini 2.5 Flash. I also like that I can use Claude 4 Sonnet without bringing my own API key. Although Windsurf also has a large model selection, I do like that with Github Copilot, I can use the Claude 4 models without using my own API key. And for that reason, I would actually prefer the Copilot model selection over Windsurf, but that might be a matter of taste, as with Copilot you don't get access to DeepSeek or Grok models, but for me that isn't very important. But the LLM themselves is only a part of what makes an agent actually useful. It also matters how each IDE calls these models. If the IDE can correctly insert the code suggestions into your codebase, and whether the agent can correctly search your codebase for relevant context to inject into your prompt. So let's first take a look at Windsurf. Windsurf, when put into write mode, is capable of directly inserting code suggestions in your codebase as was promised, especially for relatively small things like adding a loop visualizer. The write mode correctly knows how to apply this to your codebase, and this consistently works well. However, often though, when I'm in write mode in Windsurf, it isn't able to determine where it should modify the code. It does give me the option to insert the code, but this will literally insert the code at the current cursor position. And things like this never happen to me when using either Cursor or VS Code, as they always seem to figure out for themselves where they should ingest the code in my code base. This can become a bit annoying because I am used to clicking on the insert mode and you can just accidentally overwrite a huge part of your code this way. Sometimes Windsurf also doesn't seem to take into consideration code I add to the request. For example, in this case, I get an error when executing my main file, so I add both the terminal output as well as the main file to the prompt. However, Windsurf is being a bit lazy and doesn't seem to read the file I tagged and just gives me a generic answer and proposes to me to inspect the main file while I already tagged it so clearly. I want to have the agent read it, so this is a waste of a request. Being a bit lazy is maybe a trend I saw with Windsurf, as for example, I want to use the agent to set up a project, but it will just start proposing things until I explicitly say that it should definitely code it and set it up itself. And then when it eventually decides to do this, it also fails at editing files. And these editing failures happen relatively often. For example, I once again ask Windsurf to set up in this case, a default scraper so that I can later adapt it. However, the model kept struggling to edit the file, and only like after 15 attempts could it correctly insert a very basic template. So there's clearly still some work yet to be done with how Windsurf agents are implemented. I'm really not that impressed with the agent mode of Windsurf, as you can see, it very often fails. As this happens independently of which model I chose, I think this has to do something with the Windsurf implementation of an agent themselves. However, it's not like the agent is completely useless, and sometimes Windsurf can indeed edit the file in write mode, so it's not like it always fails. I was not impressed with the autocomplete model of Copilot, but let's have a look at the chat modes. Maybe because the autocomplete model was so bad, I was positively surprised by the agent capabilities. When working on a single class, it often works flawlessly to insert things. I also feel like the visuals when inserting things are very clean. The agent can once again be a bit lazy and doesn't in this case decide to modify the codebase immediately, but when I click the insert button, it will correctly insert the code into my codebase, which is something that doesn't work in Windsurf. However, the problem I still have with this agent is that it often doesn't decide to search for the correct files. For example, I ask it to implement a chat router for this assistant. However, unless I tag the class of the assistant in the request, the agent of VS Code will simply make up a methods for my assistant instead of actually searching for the method definitions in the implementation class. So you still need to explicitly tag the correct context, and you can't expect the agent to figure that out really for itself. However, besides that, the Copilot agent still sometimes does some weird things. For example, I'm asking Copilot to implement some kind of switch based on values in an enum, and I literally tag the code block where Copilot should insert this code. However, Copilot still decides to insert it at another place in the file. I've never seen this happening with Cursor before. So in general, I find the Copilot implementation of an agent better than what I've seen in Windsurf. But let's also take a look at Cursor, as I think this also has a good agent mode. For example, when I want to write a README for my C++ neural network implementation, the agent mode can correctly read all the relevant files and write a good README for me. Also, Cursor always knows where to insert the code into my codebase, so unlike Windsurf, I don't have to manually paste any code. After working with Windsurf for some time, it was also very noticeable that both the VS Code and Cursor agents seem to work much better, as they seem to have more context and actually can figure out for themselves where to insert the code. However, just like the Copilot agent, the agent mode is not perfect, and it makes the exact same mistake of not reading in certain classes relevant to the code that is being asked to be modified, and it just makes some methods up instead. So in general, I feel like the agents of both Cursor and Copilot are kind of the same quality, while the one of Windsurf is worse. However, Cursor does offer some more models, but at the same time, Cloud for Opus and O3 are not included in the subscription, while they are included with Copilot. So honestly, it's a bit of a matter of taste whether you prefer the Cursor agent implementation or the Copilot agents. One aspect which you might not have thought about, but is still very important, is the support for VS Code extensions. VS Code by itself is a very bare bones editor, and it will only really become useful when you install the right extensions. But the thing is that some of the most useful extensions, such as the Python extension, which includes the Python PyLens language server, don't always work with these VS Code forks. And note that Microsoft seems to have realized that people are forking their own product to compete with them. They are, I believe, actively trying to stop these extensions from working with these forks such as Cursor and Windsurf. And this is really annoying, as for example the best Python extension is developed by Microsoft and is now incompatible with Windsurf. So on Windsurf you don't really have a good Python language server right out of the box. So this means that unless you, I think, put in some effort and find some different extensions, you don't get any IntelliSense code completions. So you can't import classes by right-clicking. There is also no static type checking by default, so you can't see if certain variables are not declared or if you aren't assigning some random values to a variable that doesn't exist. However, at the moment the Python extension still works on Cursor, but the question of course is for how long. A while back, if you've watched my neural network from scratch video, you know that I've been programming a lot in C++, and as you guessed it, the best C++ extension is developed by Microsoft, and to use this one on Cursor, you actually have to downgrade to a previous version to make it usable. So in this regard, VS Code wins from the two other IDEs, as Microsoft simply has so many good extensions, and this will be a major challenge for both Cursor and Windsurf in the future, how they are going to approach it. For now, I can work around it by downgrading to previous versions, but this won't work forever. Of course, a bit subjective, but let's also review the general look and feel of the different IDEs. On looks alone, I believe VS Code looks the best. The UI looks very clean, and also the animations when the agent is editing your code base look very cool. Cursor looks also very clean because, once again, these are just VS Code forks, so for the most part this is indeed VS Code. However, Windsurf tries to insert its own green theme and icons instead of just using the theme that I have set up in VS Code. I understand that they want to do a bit of branding, but I don't really like this. I also feel like their Cascade editor looks a bit ugly in my opinion. Another thing that Cursor is a bit better in than the other IDEs is in the hotkeys they offer. They have hotkeys for all the important functionality, and using it you can easily switch between different models. It are things like this that I also like about Cursor, and I feel like the other IDEs are a bit lacking in this regard. Last but not least, let's take a look at the pricing. All three offer a free tier, which all give you some chat requests and some completions each month. However, you should notice that the free tier of Windsurf is really impressive, as they basically offer you an unlimited amount of auto-completions even in the free tier. This is really nice, as the autocomplete model of Windsurf, although maybe a bit worse than Cursor, is still excellent. If you decide to pay for things yourself, the Pro tier of Cursor is $20 compared to the $15 of Windsurf and the $10 of Copilot, even though the amount of usage you get for each tier of the different plans might differ a bit. In general, you could say that Cursor is a bit more expensive than Windsurf, while Windsurf is more expensive than Copilot. Unless you want a subscription which includes Cloud 4 and O3, because for that you have to pay $40 for Copilot. But as for these models, you also have to bring your own API keys into Cursor and Windsurf. It's a bit hard to compare that tier. But based on all of this and my entire experience with coding an entire project using these three IDEs, I still think that even though Cursor is a bit more expensive than the other two, it is still worth it, as the autocomplete model is extremely good and has some features like editing other files, which the other two IDEs don't even offer. The chat model is also very good, and for the moment I can still work around the limitations of certain VS Code extensions not being supported by downgrading their versions. If $20 per month is a bit too expensive for you, and if you're doubting to buy Copilot or Windsurf, I would suggest the following. If you want to have a good autocomplete functionality and don't care about the official Microsoft VS Code extensions, use Windsurf. And if you want to have a good agent but don't care about the autocompletes and just intend to use them to suggest some basic syntax, and you really care about Microsoft extensions, then I would buy Copilot. Also, if you're doubting between these two, I feel like I would probably take advantage of the Windsurf free tier, and you can do that easily by just using VS Code as your main IDE and just install the Windsurf plugin instead of the IDE. You then disable the Copilot autocompletions and use the autocompletions of Windsurf, which are completely free. If you then also want a good agent, just buy Copilot and use that one so you don't have to touch the Windsurf agents. So the conclusion is, I'm going to stick to Cursor right now. I feel like it's an excellent product. For your information, this video is not sponsored by Cursor, but if some of you work at Cursor, I fully expect to get a percentage of the revenue per user that signed up because of this video. Anyways, I hope you found this video useful. Let me know in the comments which AI IDE you are using or whether you're sticking with Vim. Anyways, I see you in the next one.